hoy día nos interesaba cerrar este ciclo, ¿no? Este viaje como de capacidades, preguntándonos en cómo liderar el desarrollo de tu proyecto. Y en ese contexto creo que nos va a acompañar Design Council de aquí, porque tiene mucha experiencia en hoy día pensar que el contexto en el que vivimos tiene que ver con un contexto de sustentabilidad y de una complejidad, digamos, llamémosle, del planeta, ¿no? Entonces, para poder liderar nuestro desarrollo, es muy importante poder pensar cuál es el impacto que lo que estamos pensando puede tener y cómo podemos prototipar ese impacto, cómo podemos aprender de las cosas que vamos haciendo en el camino mientras vamos desarrollándonos. Entonces, para hoy tenemos, como ya dije, nos acompaña, aquí estoy buscando la biografía, Kat Drew, que es la Chief Design Officer, que es algo así como la jefa principal del diseño de Design Council. El Design Council es una organización de Reino Unido que tiene muchos años llevando adelante el impacto del diseño en la sociedad. Básicamente, CAT reúne perspectivas desde la arquitectura, el diseño del sector público y la innovación empresarial para ayudar a personas a vivir vidas más saludables, felices y seguras. CAT tiene una larga trayectoria trabajando en este ámbito. Ocupó puestos en FutureGov, que es una empresa de innovación pública, As Creates, y es cofundadora del Policy Lab del gobierno del Reino Unido, además de haber trabajado ya 10 años de experiencia en muchos espacios con impacto. También nos acompaña Nat Hunter, quien es diseñadora, educadora y coach, y su foco es explorar cómo la cultura regenerativa y el comportamiento organizacional pueden tener un impacto positivo en las personas, la sociedad y el planeta. Nat lleva su experiencia como pensadora sistémica y combina el área de los negocios, el diseño y el coaching para generar y apoyar procesos de cambio. Actualmente ella es asociada del Design Council y fellow en el proyecto que les va a contar de Design for Planet, que significa el diseño para el planeta. En esta sesión, y con esto termino mi introducción, como decíamos, Nat y Kat van a ir mezclando intervenciones de clase, digamos, contenido, con interacciones de preguntas, que para eso vamos a ocupar el botón del Q&A y el chat. Y lo que yo voy a ir tratando de hacer, como lo he hecho en las otras sesiones, es ir rescatando las preguntas y su participación para ver cómo podemos generar una dinámica interactiva en este webinar. Así que cualquier pregunta por el chat, y yo los dejo entonces con Kat y Nat. Gracias.
Hi, good morning, everyone. It's lovely to be here with people from a completely different part of the world. I wish I could see you, but I just will have to know that you're there. So I'm Kat. I am the Chief Design Officer, which, as Nicholas said, is the kind of head designer at the UK Design Council. And we are the National Strategic Advisor on Design in the UK. So we promote design, we champion the very, very best of design. And in particular at the moment, we're championing Design for Planet. So Nat and myself are going to talk to you a bit about Design for Planet and how that might be really relevant in your work. And then we're going to be setting out 4 exercises which follow the title of this session. So leadership, growth, prototyping, and impact. And after each kind of section, we'll give you a bit of time to do some reflection by yourself, and then we'll hear what you've got to say in the Q&A. So I'm going to share my screen. Oops, forget. It's the right place. Right, I hope everyone can see that. So I'm going to start off by talking a bit about design. And design is obviously a kind of absolutely fundamental part of the creative economy. In the UK, when we talk about design, we talk about architecture, product design, service design, digital design, graphic design. We talked about all of these types of design, and I'm sure in the audience there will be many people who are designing in many different ways, whether you're a professional designer or you're using design approaches and creative problem solving as more of a mindset. And so the first point to make is that design shapes the world. Almost everything that surrounds us is designed in some way or other. Some things are designed really well, and they can be almost invisible. We don't notice them because they're designed so well and allow us to do what we want them to do. And some design are really, really bad and actually have been part of the reason that we've got the climate crisis, is because we've been creating too much stuff in the world that people really don't need. But design shapes the world. It's the clothes that we wear, the services, the digital services that we use, and the environments that we surround ourselves with. And of course, the climate crisis is really here. We've seen it all across the world. You'll be experiencing it in your countries in many ways. In Europe, we're experiencing it more and more. And it's not just people who are experiencing the impacts of the climate crisis. It's having a huge effect on biodiversity and nature, which is obviously making it worse, because actually biodiversity and nature and trees and plants are the very thing that keeps our world in balance. So if we lose those, the whole thing will get worse. And the other thing to say is this is not equal. There are people who are bearing the brunt of the climate crisis, particularly people living in the global south who have not been responsible for it. Much more responsible countries in Europe and in North America are producing, or the richest 1% of the world produces 50% of the carbon emissions. So it's a justice point as well. But design, in its creativity and in the things that it produces, the physical things it produces, can have a massive effect. So 80% of the environmental impact of a new product is determined at the design stage, when designers are coming up with the concept of what it is. Designers can also help shift our collective behaviours, which we all need to change if we're going to get through the climate crisis. 60% of emission reductions needed by 2035 will require societal and behaviour change. 45% of the required reductions in global greenhouse gases come from the products that we use every day. So as well as changing our energy and our transport, lots will come from our products. And also nature has a role to play. And Mother Nature is maybe the greatest designer of all. So 33% of cost-effective climate change mitigation could come from nature-based solutions like forests, like planting and rewilding seeds. And what we have to do for the climate crisis is we're going to have to redesign almost every aspect of our lives. How we consume, how we eat, how we get from A to B, how we live our lives entirely. And at Design Council in the UK, we are changing our mission to be able to support designers to do that. So this is a picture of us in 1944 when we were set up, 76 years ago, right before the end of the Second World War. And we were set up to use design to create products and industrially produced things that people wanted to buy to try and get us out of that post-war economic slump. Because design, as I'm sure you'll know, is very good at creating profit. It makes things that people want to buy. And as I say, part of some of the bad design that we've seen has actually created the climate crisis. So 76 years on, our new mission is Design for Planet. And that's a mission to galvanise and support the 1.69 million strong UK design community to Design for Planet, and also global communities across the world. Because actually the one thing we've got in the UK is Design Council is very well known around the world. Our frameworks like the Double Diamond are very well known and used across the world. So the first thing we did in November alongside COP26, so the climate change conference that all nations in the world would have attended in Glasgow, is we organised a Design for Planet festival, which showed the very, very best of design and creativity about moving us forward in the climate crisis. And this is a picture of some of us there. That beautiful building is a big museum up in Scotland called the V&A Dundee, a huge cultural institution. And what was great about this festival is we had people who were there in person, but we also had 6,000 people joining from online, and almost 50% of them were from different countries all around the world, because what's really important about this is it's a global crisis, and we need lots of people from every single country around the world to be sharing their knowledge about what they're doing, about how different cultures are approaching this. We need to learn from each other and share openly. So I'm just going to give you some examples of what we mean. So we think design has got a huge role to play, and we think it has a role to play in places. So making sure our places, our cities, our towns, our villages are designed to be sustainable, to work with nature, but also to be resilient to changes in climate, to sea risings, and kind of temperature increases. We need to make sure that we're really careful and conserve and regenerate natural resources. So thinking about circular design and how you use and reuse and disassemble and remake things. And we also have to design products, services, places, experiences that make it easy and attractive to live sustainably, that kind of create a cultural narrative about why it's so important to live in harmony with the planet. So a couple of examples here. This is a place called Portloop in a city called Birmingham in the UK. And as you can see from the photo, it's a city, it's accommodation, it's housing within a city, but it's right by a canal as well. And what's amazing about this place is that the buildings have been designed to be really low carbon. So using materials that are low carbon, thinking about the energy efficiency of buildings, but also they've got a set of island rules. So these are a set of rules for the people who live in this community. And these are all about creating community and cultural spaces where people can recycle, where people can walk to work, where they can plant their food locally, where they can come together to discuss ideas about how to live sustainably. So it's not just about the house, it's also about the community. This is a picture of a wetlands in Sentosa in Singapore. And the great thing about wetlands is they're a really good example of design with nature or design by nature. So quite often when there's flooding, traditional responses have been to put in a concrete flood defense system, but actually that's had the effect of making things worse, because carbon is obviously, concrete is not good for carbon emissions. But wetlands are really, really good examples of a natural design to soak up the water, but also they can provide amazing places for people to walk about, to enjoy, that is good for people's mental health. And also in this case, this is a tourist attraction, so it's really good for the local economy as well. So it's a really nice example of where this is benefiting, it's having positive impact for nature, for people, and for the economy. Thinking about circular design then, there's lots and lots of increasing products, things that people are making, which are able to be recycled or reused, so we're not throwing things away endlessly. This is an example called Colliebox, which is created by someone called Joe Lang from London, and it's London's first fully reusable takeaway box. So when you go to the market, you get your food in a takeaway box, and it's got a little digital code on it, so once you've eaten it, you can give it back. It gets washed and recycled rather than thrown away in the bin. And this is an example of a fashion website called Depop, which is very, very, very popular in the UK. And it's a huge online service where young people can sell and buy secondhand clothes, and there's a huge market for this. So within the fashion industry in particular, they are such a big polluter, but they're thinking really carefully about how you can reuse clothes and recycle them and rent clothes rather than buying clothes. And in terms of products, this is an example. This is actually a picture from Peru, where a British company called Safety Net Technologies has been creating a piece of technology which is a light emitting device which you put into fishing nets, which will repel the fish that you don't want and attract the fish that you do want. So it's really good for sustainable fishing. And what they've had to do is they designed it first for fishing boats up in Scotland in the north of England, and then they had to design it in a certain way that fitted with that particular community. And then they started to work with Peruvian communities, and again they had to redesign the product to fit in with how Peruvian communities fish and what they needed. So they're slightly different needs. And then finally, this is a really nice example of a credit card that called Docomany, which is not just a credit card with a limit on the money that you can spend, but also the carbon that you can spend. So it tells you when you've bought things which are exceeding your carbon limit. So all of these are good designs to help change people's behaviors. So this is really important for design, and if design is going to have this big role to play in it, design also needs to change the way it works. It can't just be producing more and more things. It has to think much more holistically about the different types of impact that it's having, not just economic impact, but also social and environmental and cultural impact. And in order for it to do that kind of more holistic look at value, it needs to work in a different way. So the first exercise I'm going to talk you through is about leading a creative project, which you're all doing, and the skills that are necessary to lead in a much more expansive and holistic way, so that you can really lead projects that think about the economic, social, environmental and cultural value that you're creating. So Nat and myself did a lot of work over the last couple of years to create something that we've called the systemic design framework. So there's a lot of information on this page. Don't worry, we won't go into all of the detail, but just to say it's available on the website, and it's made up of 3 things. It's made up of 4 characteristics, 6 principles, and an expanded process. And the process you can see on the right-hand side has got this kind of double diamond in the middle, which is our methodology for design. But it's also got a load of other activity around it. But for today, I'm going to concentrate on the 4 characteristics. So these 4 characteristics, when we interviewed a load of designers who were designing systemically, designing holistically, designing for planet, we found that they were exemplifying these different characteristics, and these characteristics were almost more important than the process that they were following. So I'll talk through them one by one and give you a couple of examples, and then I'm going to ask you to say which characteristics you're strongest at and where you want to develop. So have a think about that as I'm going through these. So the first one is the systems thinker. So that is someone who's got the ability to see how everything is connected into a bigger picture. So not just the thing you're working on, but think about how that fits into the wider world. And they're able to zoom between the micro, so designing a particular digital interface or designing a beautiful experience and how someone finds out about the experience, but also thinking about the macro and how this connects to lots of other different things. And a good example of that is, this is another wetlands. This wetlands is not in Singapore, this is in Salford in Manchester, in the kind of the north of England. And again, this is really another example of what I was saying earlier, which is usually in a flooding challenge, you would put a concrete barrier in. But this woman, the designer Teo Adebowale, she said, actually, let's not just think about the immediate problem, the flooding. Let's also ask the community who are living in the houses on the left what they need, what their aspirations are. And what they said is, well, actually, we really want somewhere to play, to walk, to be out in the open. So then that helped them shift the idea from a concrete barrier into a beautiful wetlands, which is not just good for nature and flooding because it soaks up the water, but it also provides a place for people to hang out, to walk, to cycle, to be with nature. So that's a good example of thinking systemically. The next example is the designer and maker. So this is someone who has the power to make things, as you can imagine. So they've got the creative and technical skills to put people's ideas into action. And that's particularly important sometimes when you're working in a very complex situation. It can just feel overwhelming. If everything is connected, where on earth do you even start? So designers are very, very good at making something, starting somewhere. And so the example here is the example I shared earlier of the safety net technologies, the fishing net sonar. This is where it all started. So when they were designing it, they first of all spent some time in Scotland with some fishermen, because actually when they spent time on the boats, they realized that the device was very, very difficult to use when it was really, really choppy at sea and there was big waves. So they had to redesign the actual physical product so it would be easier to hold in people's hands. Going back, the other two characteristics which are really important are the leader and storyteller. So that is someone who can tell a great story about what might be possible and get buy-in from all levels, from senior people, from communities, and have the tenacity to see the work through. And creativity in the arts, in theatre, in film, in media and TV is so important in how we tell really good stories about how the world could be, so that other people can design into that space. And finally, the connector and convener. So if you're thinking systemically and thinking about all how things link up together, you need someone to do that linking up who's amazing at creating relationships, of building trust, of being able to connect the dots between different people, so that you can create a bigger movement. So these are 4 characteristics that we think are incredibly important. And the first thing that I'm going to ask you to do is to spend 2 minutes reflecting on these questions. We've got them there on the right-hand side. And just to think by yourself, what is your strength? And where do you need some help? And that's because some people have all of these things, but most people don't. Most people have 1 or 2 maybe, but other people will have the things that you don't have. So it's really important to find others and to work in a team. So 2 questions, we'll give you 2 minutes. What is your strength out of those 4 characteristics? And where do you need some help? And then we'll do a poll so we can share our answers together. 20 more seconds and we'll move on. Okay, great. So I'm going to now stop sharing the screen because we're actually going to do this as a poll. So it would be lovely to understand from the group what our collective strengths and areas for development are. So you can see, you should be able to see on your screen, there's a poll. It's got those 2 questions. So if you can answer them now, and then we'll have a look at the results. We got the results yet?
Should I start telling you what they're written in the chat, Kat?
Yeah, I can see. Well, I can see some people. I think Domingo is saying system thinker needs some help in connecting and convening, but I can't. I don't know. You have to translate the other one.
Sí. Por ejemplo, en el Q&A, animales en peligro, dice fortaleza, crear narrativas de cómo puede ser la realidad, contar historias, create narratives. The strength is create narratives to think about how the reality could be and tell stories. Y necesita ayuda, olvidé que había translation, necesita ayuda en system thinker, conoce a un emprendedor que tiene esa habilidad. Dice.
Okay, great. So yeah, so looking at the polls, which I hope everyone can see on their screen now, it looks like that most people are, there's kind of an even split actually. So if you all got together as a group, then you would probably have all of the skills that you needed. So I think system thinker, leader, storyteller, design maker, all about 30% of you, so a third, and then slightly less on connector and convener. And I think that's where actually most people say that they would need a bit of help. So I guess the thing to think about is, who do you know in your networks who is really, really well connected, who always says, oh, I know that person, I know that person, and to go and ask them about what they do. Nat, I don't know if you've got any other advice about kind of good connectors and conveners that you know and what that looks like.
Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. No, I think, Kat, you put it brilliantly, and how interesting, isn't it, to see that everyone's really evenly split in the 4 different kinds. Sometimes when we were doing the research, sometimes one person really embodies all of them, but it's not usual for that to happen. Normally you've got 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 people who come together in a team and really make something happen. Or it could be that sometimes those characteristics are just needed in different parts of the project. But yeah, it'd be interesting to know if you find that useful to think it through.
And I think kind of as we get through the exercises, it might also be interesting for you to think about, what are you trying to achieve? Is it about trying to improve mental health, or is it about trying to decrease air pollution? Is it about trying to build awareness about climate issues? And then just to map out all of the other projects that inspire you, or who are doing something similar in that space. And as a first step, just go out and connect with them, share what you're doing, understand a little bit more about what they're doing, support each other. And you never know, there could be a really nice kind of collaboration between the 2 of you. They might have something that you don't, for example. So that's a good first tip. But has anyone, before we move on to the next exercise, we'll have to write it in the chat if you do, but has anyone got any good examples that they've done of connecting and convening? Can't see if there's any.
Quizás Yuli, que dice, mi fortaleza es conectar y convenir, y I need some help to evaluate, monetize it. Ah, estas, Yuli. It's all about connecting and convening. Do you have any example? ¿Tienes algún ejemplo? So, in technology projects, os voy a leer para que traduzcan. En proyectos de tecnología, cuando conecto UX con los programadores, es muy interesante ver cómo se relacionan y empiezan a trabajar juntos.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, if you're a really good connector and convener, it's not just about saying you need to work with this person and you need to work with this person, but actually understanding that they probably come from very different spaces and languages. So a good example is when you talk about, for example, the word memory, and I don't know if this exactly translates into Spanish or not, so you'll have to bear with me. But if you talk to a computer data person about memory, they'll think about a black box and that you can never delete memory, it's always there. And if you talk to a philosopher or a social anthropologist about memory, they think it's important to be able to forget things and it's part of the human experience. So the same word can mean two very different things to different types of people. And if you're the connector and collaborator, something quite good to do at the beginning of the project is to set out to create a shared vision so that everyone is on the same page and you're sharing the language that you're using so that everyone, knows what everyone else is talking about. There's a couple of things in the chat that I need
Sí,
a bit of help with.
Elías, no, Susana dice, su proyecto vincula mujeres de teatro de distintos territorios. Elías básicamente dice, mi habilidad es conectar con gente que conozco y voy conociendo. Domingo dice, otra forma de conectar es la combinación del diseño con políticas públicas. Voy a terminar de leer. Después está Penélope, que también habla de esta idea de vincular la sustentabilidad, el arte, el impacto social, para gestionar proyectos culturales y trabajar con organizaciones. Y Penélope sigue, claro, dice que ella trabaja en tratar de hacer eso y encontrar puntos de convergencia. ¿Qué temas les interesan? ¿Qué temas les unen? Eso ha aparecido en el chat.
Great. Thank you. And I think the important point is that the more that you can connect people from different professions or different backgrounds, that sparks more innovation. So if all the professions just kept on doing what they were doing in their own areas, we would just keep doing more of the same. And it's only by colliding ideas from different places that we get new ideas emerge from that. So it's really, really important. And actually, some of your projects might just be about providing a platform where people can come together to share ideas. And that's also amazing. So that's probably enough on the characteristics, Nat. Can I pass over to you to talk about growth or?
Yeah, should we move over? Yeah, we'll move on to the next section. Okay, thanks, Kat.
Shall I share my slides or do you want to share? You're sharing.
Fine, I've got it. Okay, so this next session, we're looking at the word growth because it's kind of fundamental to everything that's going on in the world at the moment, really. So when we think about growth in business, so you're creative entrepreneurs, when you go to business school, you get taught about business, you're usually talking about money and you're talking about a graph that kind of makes this shape. You know, it might start off a bit slow and then you want lots of growth. Maybe it doesn't grow that fast forever, it tails off a bit. And countries look for growth as well. You know, the culture that we all currently live in is a growth culture. The way countries measure their success is in the buying and selling of goods. Like, a country is doing better if there's lots and lots of things that are bought and sold. But there's two issues here. So the first issue is that growth isn't sustainable like that. Like, if we all grow, we all want to become super rich, if we all want bigger and bigger houses and cars, more and more stuff, that's one of the ways that we got in the climate crisis that we're in. And the second reason is that growth doesn't actually make us very happy. After we've got a certain amount of money, more and more money doesn't make us very happy. So going to the first point, in nature, you don't have this endless growth, this up. If you look at natural cycles in nature, you can see the word growth is here. Hoping you can see my little arrow on the screen. So here we are, these little green shoots, and they grow and they become an enormous big forest, and it's a beautiful forest. And you want the forest to kind of stay like that forever, but actually that's not what happens. The big trees collapse. I mean, if they're left to their own devices, the trees collapse, or maybe there's a fire, but there's some kind of death and decay. But from that death and decay, from the fallen tree or the fire or whatever happens in the forest, the collapse, you have an opportunity to redesign, to reorganize, to make again. And that's the picture here. And then you go back into growth. And that's what happens in nature. And when we talk about, if you might hear the word regenerative design, or just the word regenerative being used so much nowadays. And we used to talk about the word sustainable, and sustainable means keeping it exactly like it is. But we're in a climate crisis, so keeping it exactly like it is just means not making it any worse. But regenerative means changing the way we think so that everything that we do nourishes and becomes food for something else. This is the way that most countries measure their success, their buying and selling of goods. You can see this large pink is the United States, large blue is China, Mexico's over here, and the United Kingdom over here. We're about the same size. This is 2019 growth measured worldwide. It's a competition between the countries, but it doesn't show happiness, it doesn't show caring, it doesn't show culture, it doesn't show art, it doesn't show music, it doesn't show, humanity. And actually, when you look at what the happiest countries are in the world, you realize that there's a lot of those small, interesting, quiet, either Northern European or New Zealand and Canada, the countries that are very famous in a way for not having the same kind of aggression towards more and more buying and selling and consumerism. One of the factors that they measure the happiest countries in the world is generosity. I think generosity is really interesting, and it's not something that you think about in terms of a consumer culture. So Kat mentioned just now, she mentioned the idea of getting everyone together at the beginning of a project and planning what you all want to do together, which is a really, really, really important part of the process of design, like actually making time to sit down at the beginning of the project and saying, are all the right people in the room? And actually, where are we going? What does success look like? What would we do if we couldn't fail? So I just want to do a little thought experiment with you. And I want you just to sit and imagine the future. So if I was to ask you, like, what would the world be like in 2050, almost 30 years time? What would it be like if everything turned out brilliantly? Like often if you read the newspapers, you watch TV, you think about these bad, difficult, dystopian futures. But think about how old you'll be in 2050. Allow yourself to imagine yourself at that age. And ask yourself the question, like, what if you could live in your ideal world, not just your own small world, but like the greater world, like what's happening in other parts of society, what the schools like, what are the factories like, what's fashion like? What if all the problems that we currently face were solved and we were living our best lives? What if everything worked out just fine? So just sit with that sense of positivity, of like what you really want to happen in the world. I'm talking, yeah, out in society, out in your town, beyond the confines of your own house. So the question that I want you to answer, first of all to yourself and then in the chat in a minute, but just assuming you have enough money, you've got enough money, you can eat, you can go on holiday, all those things. What things out in the world are really important to you? Are you interested in education, jobs, the environment? And if you're to think about your future, the 2050 future, what 3 things that aren't money would you like to focus on growing? If you're thinking about growth, what factors? It could be something tangible or intangible. It could be a sense of community. It could be love. It could be anything. What 3 things would you like to have been part of creating by 2050? Just have a little think for a minute, and then when you're ready, type your answers in the chat. Great. So if everyone would like to type into the chat or Q&A, the 3 things you would like to see more of in 2050. And I'm just going to stop sharing the screen for a minute. And Nicholas, we might need your wonderful translation.
Here I am. It's not really a translation, it's reading in Spanish and then well, Yuli speaks in English. It says, sorry. So Luis, it says arte. 2, poner tus talentos al servicio de los demás. 3, innovación. Grecia dice comunidad, igualdad de género, regeneración de la naturaleza. Sofía dice, en 2050, muchos árboles, la ciudad con ciclovías, más empleados creativos y culturales. Elías dice, comunidad trans, amor, espiritualidad. Alejandra dice, me gustaría enfocar mi crecimiento al impacto social y ambiental a partir del diseño del producto, manejo de las emociones, cómo seguir dándole fuerza a mi emprendimiento. Flores Isaac dice, formar comunidad, acceso al arte como derecho y como herramienta de cambio social, e inclusión. Domingo dice, no, está escribiendo todavía. Eso ha aparecido por el momento.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Kat, if you feel like coming back. What's really, I'm feeling like my heart is expanding at reading those, and we're going to be using those things that you've tapped into as we go through the rest of this session. But every time you ask a group of people to imagine the future that you want, every single time, it's about community, it's about connection, it's about more trees, it's about these more acceptance. And it's really, really important. We'll get to later some more practical things, but just I want you to really keep that in mind, like write down the 3 things that you would most like to influence, and we'll come back to them a little bit later on. So Kat, would you like to take over the next section?
Oops, sure thing. And yeah, just on that point, it is so nice to hear all those different words about the different types of value that kind of design and creativity can create for the world. And these are the sorts of things that we really want to be making visible, so that more designers can see that they can design these things too. So thank you for all of those. I will share my screen again. Hang on a second. Oops. Get to the right place. Oops. So go through that bit, sorry. So the next part is about, we've talked about leading, we've talked about growth, now we're going to talk about prototyping. So prototyping, I don't know how many people have heard of the word prototype before, but essentially it's a way of testing ideas and gathering feedback from people or nature to make improvements. And 3 principles about prototyping is that you test early before an idea is finalized. You test it ugly, so it doesn't have to be perfect. Actually, it's better if it isn't, because then you can make changes easily. You're not wedded to this perfectly designed idea. And you test often. So not just once, but you're constantly making changes and putting something back out into the world, getting feedback, changing it, and so on. So to give you some examples of prototypes, if you've not seen them before, these are various different prototypes of a vacuum cleaner. I think it's a Dyson. And as you can see over on the left, it's made out of cardboard. And that's obviously much cheaper to make a cardboard version of a vacuum cleaner than, you know, a high spec one made out of plastics and so on. And that's because you can test the shape of it. You can put stuff in there to test the weight of it. You can start to kind of feel how it's going to be used, how it's going to be stored, how it's going to be carried. All of these really different important things about making it easy to use and change it. Oops. This is another example of a prototype. So if you work in the fashion industry, you're prototyping all the time because you're making dresses first out of patterns, out of paper, and putting them together to see if they work before you then construct them out of more expensive fabric. So prototypes are used all the time in design. And a couple of points is the quality and the fidelity of the prototype develops over time, the more you test and make and learn. So they start off kind of very low fidelity, made out of cardboard, out of paper, really cheap materials that you can then, you don't mind kind of throwing away into the recycling bin and remaking as you kind of work out what works. And you might start off with a lot of ideas, and over time you might refine those ideas to 1 or 2 that really work because you've tested them, you've iterated them, you find out what the best idea is. But prototyping is also good, not just to test and see if something works or not, but also it's really good as putting out an idea that might be in your head into the world so that you can attract lots of other people's ideas to it, lots of other people's energies to it, you know, as a way of collecting and convening, putting something out into the world which isn't finished but shows a vision of what the future could be like, is a really good way of attracting people to say, come and be involved in my project. So a couple of examples. This is an example of a hospital in London, in the UK. And you can see it's a pharmacy, so it's where you get your prescription drugs. And they had a real problem at this hospital because there were huge queues for the pharmacy, and people were getting really frustrated because they didn't know why their drugs were taking so long to be made for them. And that was because the pharmacy staff were all the way in the back, behind the scenes, so people couldn't see that they were working. So they started off by prototyping how to make it all more visible for people to see, people to show that people were working actually to make people's drugs. And so everyone just stopped panicking so much. But you can see on the left here, on the right, sorry, you can see the final kind of idea was that you've got these different stations where the people are working. It's kind of fun. You get your receipts comes down through the kind of slide there, which is good for kids. Kids really enjoy it. But obviously that's quite expensive. So to start off with, they started by just using cardboard to prototype what that looks like, because also, you know, there still has to be a certain amount of privacy about it. So people are speaking within a kind of a slightly private box there. So that tests how something will work in practicality. But as I said, prototyping is also good to create more ideas. So this is an example from the Design Studio for Social Intervention in Boston in the United States. And there they were really interested in what a public kitchen would look like. So in many communities around the world, the tradition is that you have your own kitchen. Each household has your own kitchen. Each household cooks alone. But obviously that's very different from other communities in the world where people cook much more collectively. So they were really playing with the idea about what would you do with a public kitchen, a bit like a public library. So, you know, that costs an awful lot to make. So instead they just prototyped one over the weekend. They set up a space where they created a kind of a public eating space. Anyone could put on a kind of a collective meal. They ran workshops, they did talks. And out of that idea, loads more ideas kind of came out of it. So it was a really good example of how prototyping can paint a picture of what something could be. Doesn't need to be the final idea, but actually can generate many, many more ideas. So some questions for you, and we'll give you 5 minutes, I think, to think through these, and then we'll hear from some of your answers. What do you want to find out about how your idea might work? So what do you want to find out and test? Second question is, where are you worried that it might not work? So where do you think, oof, actually, I'm not sure this will really work. I better test that before I make something very expensive. And what could you do tomorrow to test it? So not a week's time, not in a month's time. What could you do tomorrow? What simple thing could you do tomorrow to test it? So I'll give you 5 minutes, and maybe everyone could think and write down their responses, and then I would love to hear about them. Okay, we'll give you 1 more minute. Great, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And
Aquí. Entonces, Domingo dice, por medio de la cultura se puede impactar positivamente la vida de los niños y adolescentes. 2, que no haya suficiente participación ciudadana para la detección de esas futuras mejoras, y le gustaría realizar un pequeño prototipo con un grupo de niños para comprobar esa idea. Ese es Domingo. I'm going to read 3 or 4 and then you reply, something like that. Mark dice, el reto es cómo poder hacer llegar los reportes de accesibilidad a las empresas de tal manera que puedan comprender los beneficios e impacto en los documentos que generan, así como la información que generan. Quizás podría ser más específico, más de qué te gustaría prototipar. So some ideas in English. Cómo diseñar la idea de forma más flexible para diferentes personas. Julie dice, tenemos ideas muy disruptivas que pueden ser diferentes a las normales. Sin embargo, en una sociedad capitalista orientada al crecimiento económico y la industrialización, ¿cómo las pueden probar a ellas para inversores? Grecia lo dice en inglés. You can read. ¿Qué? ¿Qué probar? Si hay interés en un workshop que estoy desarrollando, lo que me preocupa es no atraer suficientes estudiantes y me gustaría probarlo a través de encuestas y un landing page, dice Grecia. Should I read all of them or you want to say something there?
I can say something.
Okay.
Yeah, I can say something. So I think you know, testing ideas with kids, with groups of students is great. And I would say almost, I mean, I think the landing page is a really good way of testing things. You can mock that up and just say what the workshop's going to be about and get people to like register interest. That's a really easy way. You could also put on a workshop for 3 or 4 people to run through it and see how that goes and get some feedback. Often through running it yourself, you'll realize what works and what doesn't work. At the end, you could do a survey with them to say, you know, how it went, but also if you're charging for it, how much will you pay for it? You know, so you can test all those different things. And I think it's really, really important to design, you know, if you're designing with kids, that's really, really important because we're adults. So we can't help but design things thinking about how we would use things, what height things need to be, you know, all the things that we kind of probably take for granted. So designing with kids is really, really important. There was a question about kind of how do we design for a disruptive idea that might kind of challenge the current economic model. And I think this is a really interesting one because actually, you know, we are working within the current system, but trying to shift to another system. So I think the way there is to kind of think about the other types of value that you would want to create, whether that's environmental value, social value, kind of interesting things about kind of different models of growth, but also, you know, to recognize that actually to get current investors investing in that, you know, they are going to be interested in kind of how that kind of can be used by a lot of people, but if it has that wider social and environmental value at the same time, then that can be a positive thing. So actually then kind of it kind of works across the triple bottom line. Nat, have you got any thoughts of any of those? Oh, you're on mute.
No, I think it's really great to just hear people's plans to prototype, because it's so important. Like, people get stuck in that thing that they're afraid of, and actually going out and doing tests is just such a brilliant way to get feedback. But I was just thinking about what you were saying about demonstrating value. That's something we're going to be talking about in the next section as well, so that leads in nicely.
Yeah, and I think someone put a question there about kind of accessibility and how can you show that you're designing for accessibility. Well, actually through prototyping, you really can. And so you could start off with kind of testing with 8 people and showing how you changed things to make it more accessible. Like a good example from our work, or work that I know, is a couple of young entrepreneurs were designing a watch for older people. So they were in their 20s, but they were designing a watch for older people, so that if they fell over, they could press it, and then someone could come and help them. And initially, they designed it with a big red button here, so it was really easy, they assume, for people to press. But when they tested it and prototyped it with older people, they were saying, well, we don't want a massive red button here, because otherwise I'm walking around with a massive red button and everyone knows that I'm really frail. So they put it on the inside of the hand, which is much more subtle for people to use it. And initially as well, when they were prototyping it, they had assumed that people would be wearing it within the house. So people would be able to kind of move around within the house. But actually, when they prototyped it, people were saying, actually, this is really helpful for us to be able to have the confidence to walk to the shops or to go outside. So actually what it was doing is it was helping to save money from the local council, who otherwise would have to collect them in a minibus and take them shopping or take them to wherever they wanted to go. This meant that they could do it themselves. So it was actually saving money in the long run. So that's another way of kind of creating savings for investors. It's not always through making money, but it's showing how they can save money elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Let's move on, Nat, to the final bit.
Okay, final section. So for this last section, we're going to be talking about the impact side. So the social or environmental impact. So this is a little diagram just to show that we all have impact on the world. You probably all know this, but quite a lot of people often say, there's nothing I can do to change the world. But actually, we all have loads and loads of influence. You know, there's a little ripple effect that goes out. And we think of ourselves as individuals, but we're all connected. So if you're running a business, even if it's a tiny business, even if it's just you in the business or you and one other person, you might be employing people. You might have customers, you might have products, you might have some kind of community. And if you influence them, then they go and influence their customers, their friends, their suppliers. And we can each make decisions. Like, so for instance, when we were talking earlier about the 3 things that we wanted to change, be part of changing in the future. So let's say that the environment or the kind of natural world was really important to you. Then when you were thinking about buying something, you know, let's say you had a party to launch your business, you think about, you've got all sorts of choices that you can make there. You can choose that the caterers or whoever makes your food uses local food or organic food or employs a certain kind of person. And if you really bring awareness to the fact that every time you work with somebody else, you have a choice about who you work with. And, you know, I've seen that in action. When you say to somebody, like let's say you wanted to print something, and a printer came to you and said, oh, you know, I'll give you a really good deal on printing this poster for you. If you were able to say, I'd really like to print with you, but I have my company values say that I must only print on recycled paper and then you're influencing that printer at that point, because he or she might say, oh, right, people care about this kind of thing. Maybe I'll look into it. Also, sometimes we can get a bit narrow about what we think we're impacting. This diagram shows someone who's thinking very much about carbon emissions. Like, carbon emissions are the thing that lots of people are talking about. But actually, all these kind of social and environmental issues, they're all interconnected. Like, there's a kind of systemic interconnection. All these lines between everything is trying to indicate that. So we need to kind of step back from just thinking about one thing, and at the very least understand the interconnectedness of everything. So start looking at some of the other things that we are also impacting just by running a business. Even if it's a small business, you could choose to bring your time or your creativity or some other kind of attention to something else in this system. I have a feeling that in a previous session, you've seen the UN Sustainable Development Goals. If you haven't, then I think it's really interesting to think about the things that you want to happen in the future and to map them against these goals. So what's really interesting about the UN Sustainable Development Goals is it's a set of worldwide goals that is not focusing on making money, it's focusing on positive social and environmental impact, which means that companies, you know, the huge companies have other kinds of goals other than just making money. So if you go and look at any of the big companies, they're usually saying, we are focusing on goals 9 and 11, or, you know, we are focusing on goals 7, 8, and 9. And it's become quite normal for companies to think about the sustainable development goals. So we thought it would be interesting if you think about your the 3 things from earlier from the 2050 vision that you want to be part of making happen, and just map them against these goals. So the question is, think about the hopeful future you imagined, the 3 things you'd like to be part of growing. And I'm going to rewind in a minute to that other slide, to the Sustainable Development Goals, and ask yourself, which of the goals do you most connect with? If you had to say, or find out more about one of those goals, which would it be? So if you said that you were interested in trees, someone mentioned trees earlier, then maybe it's goal number 15, life on land, or maybe it's more to do with 11, sustainable cities and communities. So just spend a minute looking at those sustainable development goals and see which ones that you think you might be most interested in, and just write down those numbers in the chat. Great,
Should I read
some...
that? Oh wow,
that's right. You don't have to translate numbers. Perfect. Thank you, Nicholas. Great, so you're starting to come in, lots of different goals being typed in the chat. Brilliant. Lots of 1s, lots of 5s, lots of 17s. Brilliant. So great, keep them coming. And just keep those numbers written down for yourself as well. Oh, someone's got 5 goals. That's good, Sophia. Keep those goals written down for yourself as well, and maybe look into them some more and see if it's something that you could commit to. That's brilliant. Right, in the interest of time, I'm going to just move on to the next and final section. So we're going to talk about another level of business models. So you've identified what's important to you, what parts of the future you want to be creating. And the ideal business model is equal parts impact, social environmental impact, making that 2050 of your imagination possible, and revenue, making money, making the business work. So I'm sure you've all got a good idea of how to make revenue, but here's a little list that I think is interesting. So you can make money by charging per hour for a service. You can make money by charging a flat rate for a project, from selling things online, from e-commerce. You can put something out there and ask people to pay whatever they feel like. You can have a freemium model. You can ask for donations. Memberships and subscriptions are very common these days. You can sell advertising, or you can raise sponsorship. So there's more examples than that, but I just wanted to represent, these are some ways that you can make money. You can sell your time, you can sell products, you can ask for money. So on the other hand, the impact model, the red on the left-hand side, it's a sustainable way to create impact in the world and to feel like you've got a sense of purpose. So if a business only has the impact model, they might feel that they're living their purpose, but that sense of fulfillment will be really short-lived because you haven't got enough money to sustain the organization. But on the other hand, and I see this time and time again, if you go for just the revenue model, you'll generate income, but then you've got a very, very high chance of experiencing burnout because there's a lack of purpose in your everyday work. I know people who've started companies and they've taken investment that's only about money, and then they lie awake at night hating themselves because they went against their values. 3 years in, they don't know how to get out of it. So at the beginning of your journey, it's really important to get this nice balance of impact and revenue. And now I'm going to give you just a few examples of the kinds of companies that are creating impact and making revenue. Just the kinds of companies that are doing this. So for instance, you can be the kind of company that is raising social awareness. It could be that it's around a particular cause, like any of the things that people mentioned earlier. So that could be what you do, but you also make money from it. So an example of a company that does this is a company called Sevenly, and they make t-shirts, and people can print t-shirts through them, but the t-shirts are all about raising awareness of social issues. And they raised $10 million for all these good causes, as well as making money for themselves. So that's a good example of a social awareness business model. This is one that many of you will be aware of. So it could just be that your reason of existence in the world is to promote creativity. And maybe that's your main line of business. So you might be like, so someone like Lego who makes Legos. You could argue that it's a good company to have in the world because it promotes creativity. Or it could be that it's more of a sideline for your project. It could be that you run a cafe, but in the evenings you open it out and you hold art classes there. So there's lots of different ways of promoting creativity. Another example is people who are really thinking about their immediate environment and they want to create local jobs. So you could be working somewhere and you think, God, there really aren't any jobs for local people, and you could make that part of your mission. So you could be running an art gallery, but you decide that all your employees are going to live within 3 kilometers of your gallery. And you just make these decisions, and then you can see what impact you have on the local environment. Another example is open source. And what's really interesting about open source is you publish things. We talked about generosity earlier. Like, open source is very generous. It's very much normal in a digital world at the moment. With you might open source your code for a digital product. The picture in there is a 3D printer. There's a few 3D printer companies that are open source, and the open source companies really benefit from that generosity. There's a really nice example of there's a Japanese company, and they were making robot arms, and they open sourced their robot arm, and the open source community got on and understood how this robot arm worked, and they improved it. So you're kind of crowdsourcing knowledge and information. But what's really interesting now is that people are starting to open source other kinds of things. Like, I was discovering recently that people are open sourcing the salaries that they pay people. And why are people so secretive about what we pay ourselves? So maybe you're transparent and open about some of the processes, how much you pay people. But I think what's really nice is that Kat talked earlier about connecting with other people who are trying to do the same thing as you. And that's the kind of part of the connecting and convening role. And open source also is another way to do that. If you think, oh, I'm doing something that could be really helpful to other people who are doing things like me, you can make things open. Another example is conscious sourcing. I think I just mentioned this. If you were to have a party or an event for your business, really consciously think about who you're employing to have that party, for instance. Or if you have to buy some paper or some pens or a computer, think about which companies you buy from. Another common way to address the balance in the world is something like 1% for the planet. So a company like Patagonia, they give 1% of everything that they make to the planet. They've raised $89 million so far, and they've given it all to environmental causes. So it's a very simple way you can do your business, and you can say, right, 1% of all my profit goes to causes that I believe in. We must also always talk about recycling and upcycling, or creating a product that can be can be taken back at the end of its life and repurposed. So this would very much be an impact model. If you're making anything physical, think about the materials you're making it from and what happens to it at the end of its life. And the last example on this is a sliding scale cost. So you might say, I'm running an event, but I want the event to be much cheaper if you're unemployed, or more expensive if you're on a high wage. So that's another example of just considering the different kinds of people in your community. So there's a little graph here of, so here's revenue and here's impact. And ideally you want to be here, you want to be having high impact and high revenue. If you're down here with low impact and low revenue, then you're doing something wrong. And I think people often put the impact side second, but I really, really believe that it's important to make them both as important as each other, because ultimately you'll enjoy your work more, which will make your company more successful. So finally, I wanted to talk about measuring your impact. Now, this might seem really obvious to some of you. You'll be like, yeah, of course we're doing this, but you'd be surprised how many people forget to do this. And especially if you're working really hard, you're working on your own, you forget about measurement. So if you have an idea of where you want to go with impact, so with money, you can measure it, right? So money, how much money have I got in my bank account? How much money did I earn today? You know, that you've got the nice graph with your money. But with social or environmental impact, you don't have that immediate feedback unless you go out and look for it. So let's say you decided you were going to plant a tree for every 10 sales that you made. If you don't count the number of trees that you've planted, then you've got no idea what impact you're making. So there are some really simple things that you can do, but I really encourage you to start early and to make sure that you record things regularly. So for instance, people forget to record their social media statistics, like what's your reach, all the insights on Instagram, and record them, screen grab it, put it in a spreadsheet, but know what your growth in your social media has been over a year, and you can see how much impact you're having on your community. Maybe it's numbers of people coming to an event. Instead of just opening the door and letting people come in, make them sign in, make them sign up for some kind of form online so that you know who's come. You can find if people come again and again, or whether they come once and then they go away again. See if you can get their email addresses. I know it sounds obvious, but it's really, really useful. Another thing that you can do is to do an online survey. So let's say you want to get, I don't know, more people doing something, cycling. You could do an online survey at the start of when you're starting out. How much do you cycle? How many days a week do you cycle to work? Whatever you want to ask. And then you can carry on surveying over the length of a project, and you can see if you've got progress. And one of the reasons to do measuring is that you know that if you're going in the right direction, but you also know if you're going in the wrong direction. So maybe the numbers of people coming to an event and the people coming to an event, maybe they only ever come once. So you think, well, I'm doing something wrong. Maybe you do an online survey and you're not noticing any difference. So then you would go and prototype a different direction, try something else. And some impact is quantitative, like you can count it, but some impact isn't. So the last thing that I wrote down is interviewing people, because you might want to know things that are more subtle that you can't count. You might want to know about people's mental health or attitudes towards things. And that might be something where you actually go and sit with people or ask people in the street and actually talk to people. And I'm sure you can find many more creative ways to measure, but measure early, measure often, keep measuring, and either be very happy that you're getting towards your goal, or realize that you have to adjust things and use that measurement as a way of knowing that you have to adjust things. So I think we're back in the room, and maybe it's time for some questions. We've talked about roles in the team. we've talked about what you want to happen by what you want to happen by the time we get to 2050, what you want to grow, which sustainable development goals they map against, how to prototype and ideas for prototyping, and then different ways you can organize your business to really enhance that impact and make it happen.
Muchas gracias, Kat y Nat, por la charla, la clase interactiva. Creo que ha sido muy útil y bien interesante como cierra, lo hemos visto en las presentaciones. Yo creo que mientras piensan algunas preguntas, esta es una primera pregunta quizás que hemos hecho a la mayoría de los panelistas. ¿Qué creen ustedes que es, luego de los ejemplos que han mostrado, de las distintas materias que hemos cubierto, en su opinión, qué es particular y característico del impacto, de la medición de impacto y el desarrollo de estos prototipos en proyectos culturales? Muchos de nuestros asistentes, o la mayoría, son jóvenes creadores que tienen proyectos muy pequeños, locales, que son proyectos locales que se vinculan con la comunidad local y cuyo impacto muchas veces, si bien es multidimensional, son impactos que son difíciles de medir en gran escala, porque son más bien, por decirlo así, son como espacios que influyen en una comunidad que puede ser pequeña, pero que es muy diversa. Entonces, ¿qué recomendación darían si ellos, en la etapa en la que están principalmente buscando apoyo, saliendo a ver quiénes son sus clientes, tratando de empezar recién a formular su proyecto? ¿Qué consejo darían a estos jóvenes creadores o jóvenes emprendedores para empezar a incorporar esta visión de impacto dentro de lo que están haciendo?
So, I mean, I would still, I would probably still look back at some of the kind of sustainable development goals and just think about kind of, because those are global goals and the things that you might be measuring. So things about kind of education or mental health can be taken right down to kind of community level. So you can see how these things can scale. I mean, I would, so I would think about where they broadly fit into kind of environmental, social and economic and cultural metrics. And then I think it's about asking the community kind of what's relevant to them, and making sure you get feedback on that, and then being able to show kind of to investors how the work in this community can add up to some of the bigger goals that they might have, which might be around some people talk about ESG, so environmental and social impact. Some people talk about the sustainable development goals. So I think it's that kind of translation piece that you need to do between finding out from people what value that they see in the project and then being able to translate that into some of these bigger goals. So there's no perfect answer. It's not like the pound sign or the dollar sign where you can kind of aggregate together, or the peso sign where you can aggregate together everything. It is kind of, you know, different for different communities. But I think if you can do that translation piece about how showing how community kind of feedback is linked to these bigger goals, then that's the thing that'll be interesting for investors.
Great, gracias.
And I still come back to the thought, you know, we knew when we were developing this talk that the audience was, you know, working at a really small scale. I work a lot with students, you know, there's a huge amount you can do at a small scale. You've just got to, you know, you can measure tiny things, and as long as you know the path that you want to walk along, and you know you're making some kind of progress, then that's all good. And joining up with other people who are doing similar things.
Yeah.
Perfecto. Hay otra pregunta acá que está en inglés de Uli. Nat, for you, Nat. It's in English, you can read it, but tú mencionaste que demostrar los valores, cómo demostrar el cambio de los valores, o el cambio del paradigma de los valores desde hacer dinero a un impacto positivo. en el fondo lo que entiendo es cómo demostrar ese cambio, digamos, ese cambio de paradigma.
It's a very, very good question. There is so much evidence. There are so many books written about how I can sense, Uli, from your previous questions, that you really feel like you're in an existing paradigm, but with your investors, you're trying to show you want to shift into a new paradigm. And I think what I would say is, like, if you have value, if you have strong values, then it's just really important to stick to them and find ways to demonstrate it. There are people doing all sorts of creative ways of trying to demonstrate value. In the UK at the moment, there are people who are using artificial intelligence with trees to help demonstrate the value of a tree to the local authorities, because the local authorities chop the tree down because it just represents timber. But in other value systems, the tree represents beauty or shelter or nature. And so it's something that people around the world are collectively working on so much at the moment. So I think all I would say is just keep your eyes and ears open for innovative ways to show value, because it's so personal. What would you say, Kat, about that?
Yeah, I mean, I've just put something in the chat which I was really inspired by, which is a concept called sisterhood economics, or the feminine economy. Now, this does not mean that it can only be women who do this type of economics, but it's a just different type of economics, which is about obviously making money so that we can live and there's livelihood, but it's not about endless growth. And so it's a set of examples about where businesses have thought about money at the same time as generosity and care and connections and all these things that Nat was talking about. And what's interesting about some of the examples there is not all of them, what they want to do is they want to scale their impact, but they themselves don't want to scale. And I think that's really important, because, you know, probably all of you as kind of entrepreneurs, as business people, trying desperately always to scale is exhausting, and it exhausts people and people burn out. And actually the power of kind of you working with others who've got a similar mission means that collectively you can have that bigger scale without all of you having to exhaust yourself by individual organizations growing. And if you're working with communities, that's even more important, because actually communities are different and what works in one community won't work elsewhere. So it's much more about kind of stitching and weaving all these different organizations together and achieving impact collectively, rather than one or two scaling and being kind of monopolies all over the world. And I think, you know, for investors, this is an interesting thing about how the system does need to shift, though. So, you know, what if an investor could invest in a number of small businesses or entrepreneurs together rather than just in one? So they're investing in the collective rather than individuals. Now, I don't have the answer for that, but, you know, it could be that a number of you come together as a collective and put forward a proposal to an investor. So, you know, you don't have to wait for the system to change. You can propose how the system needs to change itself.
I also just typed in the chat that I think find out if your investors are interested in something. Like a lot of investors now are interested in climate crisis in some way, or they might feel like it's something tangible. That, like in Europe, a lot of countries worldwide have committed to this idea of net zero by 2050, and that is a kind of galvanizing goal for a huge amount of companies, because they're going, oh my God, we've got to reach net zero by 2050. So then you come along with your small organization and you say, I will help you get to net zero by doing this, this, and this, and then you show your evidence. So that's why things like sustainable development goals and net zero are useful, Because if you have a company or an investor who's interested in any of the goals or net zero, then you can work with that.
Hay otras preguntas moviéndose más al tema de prototipado, yo creo, ¿no? Hay como dos preguntas acá, una en inglés a Giovanni. ¿Cuán integradas deben estar las necesidades emocionales, económicas, sociales en el prototipo? Yo creo que es como cómo integrarlas, me imagino. How to integrate them might be that question. So I'm going to say in English, in your viewpoint, how integrated the customer needs into prototype? These needs could be emotional, economic, social for engaged clients. So how you should introduce those needs in the prototype in order to engage clients? I think that's the question.
Yeah, I think all of those are really important. So you need to make sure that kind of when you're prototyping, it's something that people want, that are kind of is delightful. That emotional connection is really important. It has to kind of do the thing that it's supposed to do, meet the social benefits for the user, whether that's kind of well-being or kind of health or whatever it is. And it has to be kind of affordable. So if you're selling something, there's no point in selling something really expensive because probably the people that you want to reach aren't going to afford it. So it's a bit like when you prototype, there's a kind of Venn diagram that you often see, which is desirability, feasibility, and now I've forgotten the last one. Someone else help me out. Viability. So it's got to work. It's got to do the thing that you were setting out to do, achieve the impact. It's got to be desirable. People have to want to emotionally connect with it. And it's got to be feasible. It's got to work, and it's got to be affordable to produce.
And en esa misma línea, hay una pregunta de Penélope. ¿Cuál es la importancia o qué podría ser la importancia particular de estas metodologías de diseño o este mindset también que ustedes proponen para definir las programaciones culturales y en general nuestras prácticas como agentes culturales? Una pregunta un poco distinta, tiene que ver con a nivel de la programación cultural. ¿Qué opinión tienen de cómo ocupar el diseño para eso?
Well, I suppose on a kind of broader level, design as a kind of problem-solving process can help you define what the cultural programs need to be. So, you know, understanding kind of what exists already, what amazing cultural assets there are already to use. So you're not creating new, you're starting with what exists. You're also engaging with people and understanding what motivates them, why they might be engaged in culture, what they need as well. And then to design a cultural program that kind of fits those aspirations, that builds on what exists, and that can also serve some bigger objectives around, for example, awareness and behaviour change around the climate.
And then if you were to think about the impact goals in there as well, your cultural programming might, maybe you have cultural programming around different impacts. Around the ideas of community or nature, or if that isn't appropriate, maybe you give a percentage of your revenue to one of these organizations, or you think about the venues that you operate within. So I think that everything that we've talked about is relevant.
Great, thank you, Daisy. Thank you very much. Yeah, vi aquí también, Nat, pusiste a Kate Rawhord, Donut Economics, también Sisterhood Economics. ¿Podría ser posible, preguntan, si luego, después de la sesión, pudiesen compartir una serie de links y recursos de lo que ustedes consideran interesante para seguir aprendiendo? If you could share later kind of links through email, and we can let them go. Ok, entonces hemos llegado al final de esta sesión. No hay más preguntas. Thank you very much. Muy útil, muy interesante. Creo que ha sido hermosos gráficos, great graphics. It's not your image. todavía tenemos bastantes usuarios. Y si no hay más preguntas, bueno, agradecer a Nat y Kat por esta brillante sesión. Y nada, agradecer a British Council, agradecer a Impact Hub, agradecer a Design Council y agradecer a todos los que han participado en estas sesiones. Como dije al principio, creo que ha sido muy enriquecedor. Y nada, ya estaremos en contacto. Como estoy en las redes, mi @ es nrebolledo. Ahí está. Ok, muchas gracias y que estén muy bien. Chao.